On the morning of June 19, 1944, at 10:07 a.m., a fighter direction officer positioned within the darkened Combat Information Center aboard the USS Lexington observed green phosphorescent blips moving across his radar screen. These contacts, located 130 miles west of his position, represented 69 Japanese aircraft heading directly toward Task Force 58. The radar display provided complete situational awareness, showing the Japanese formation, the American carriers, and the empty ocean separating them. Over the following 12 minutes, fighter directors across the task force would need to coordinate the interception of those 69 enemy aircraft. This coordination involved dozens of Grumman F6F Hellcat fighters dispersed across 3 different altitudes and separated by miles of the Philippine Sea. The Americans possessed a technological advantage of such magnitude that the events of the next 17 minutes would fundamentally alter naval warfare. Japanese strategic planning. Japanese pilots had launched from 9 carriers that morning under the command of Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa. The first wave consisted of 69 aircraft, comprising Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Yokosuka D4Y dive bombers, and Nakajima B6N torpedo planes. Their operational plan followed conventional doctrine: proceed to the American carriers, execute attacks from altitude, and sink as many vessels as possible. The Americans operated 15 carriers, and Japanese planners calculated that destroying at least 5 would shift the strategic balance in their favor. Japanese pilots understood that American aircraft were robust, and American pilots were highly skilled. However, they believed they would have visual warning of approaching American fighters. This assumption proved catastrophically incorrect. At that precise moment, every movement of their formation was being tracked by SK-2 air search radar aboard the battleship Alabama. The Japanese formation had been detected at 150 miles range and was being plotted on transparent vertical boards in multiple combat information centers throughout the task force. Teams of radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors were analyzing this information and preparing to vector American fighters to intercept the formation well before it could approach the carriers. Early morning developments. Earlier that morning at 7:45 a.m., an act of exceptional courage had temporarily protected the Japanese fleet. As the carrier Taiho launched her second wave, the submarine USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at the flagship. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, a strike pilot who had just taken off in his Yokosuka D4Y dive bomber, observed the torpedo wake streaking toward his carrier. He broke formation, dove his aircraft into the path of one torpedo, and deliberately crashed into it. The torpedo detonated instantly, and Komatsu perished. His sacrifice destroyed 1 torpedo, but the remaining 5 continued toward Taiho. 4 missed their target. The 6th struck the carrier's starboard side, rupturing fuel tanks and jamming the forward elevator. The damage initially appeared minor, and Taiho continued launching aircraft. However, ruptured fuel lines were filling the ship with explosive vapors, transforming the carrier into a floating bomb. Komatsu's heroism delayed the inevitable by several hours rather than preventing it. Testing American defenses. The first major test of American radar-directed fighter defense had occurred on June 11, 1944. Task Force 58 launched a massive strike against Saipan, deploying 208 fighters and 8 torpedo bombers against Japanese positions across the island. American pilots claimed 86 aerial victories, plus 33 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Japanese pilots attempting to intercept the strike discovered American Hellcats positioned at precise altitudes and headings. This positioning resulted not from chance or fortune, but from radar detection and coordinated vector assignments from combat information centers aboard multiple carriers. Japanese pilots reported that American fighters appeared without warning, perfectly positioned for engagement. Their commanders attributed this to coincidence, but this assessment was incorrect. The Americans were tracking every Japanese aircraft from the moment it departed its base. Evolution of the Combat Information Center. What the Japanese forces failed to understand was that they were no longer engaging individual pilots. They were confronting an integrated system. By mid-1944, the Combat Information Center had become the operational nerve center of American carrier operations. This concept had evolved from difficult lessons learned in 1942. At the Battle of Midway, American carriers had operated with minimal situational awareness. Radar existed but remained primitive. Communication between ships was chaotic. Fighter direction occurred through estimation and visual sighting. Carriers were lost because the defensive system could not position fighters effectively. Following Midway, the Navy recognized the need for substantial improvement. Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff studied the problem comprehensively. They examined British experiences with radar-directed fighter control and analyzed radio communication failures. In November 1942, the Pacific Fleet issued Tactical Bulletin 4TB-42, establishing standardized fighter direction procedures. In January 1943, Admiral Ernest King formally renamed the Coordination Center the Combat Information Center. By early 1944, every new carrier incorporated a dedicated CIC space with trained operators. System integration and operation. The system functioned through comprehensive integration. Multiple ships equipped with SK-2 air search radar detected incoming raids at ranges up to 150 miles. The radar returns appeared on circular scopes with rotating sweep lines. Operators called out range and bearing information. Enlisted plotters marked the contacts on large, transparent vertical plotting boards using grease pencils. Different colors designated different raid types, with numbers assigned to each group. The plots displayed everything simultaneously: enemy aircraft, friendly fighters, and surface ships, all on one display visible to everyone in the CIC. The fighter direction officer stood behind the plotters, observing the entire tactical picture develop in real time. He maintained radio communication with every Hellcat airborne through VHF radio systems that provided clear, reliable communication on multiple frequencies to prevent interference. The radar equipment allowed for simultaneous tracking and the timely deployment of counter-aircraft gunners and fighter interceptors. The officer could observe the fighters on the plot, see the incoming raid, and calculate intercept courses, altitudes, and timing. He would then use the radio to vector fighters into position with precise instructions regarding heading, altitude, and target information. The fighters would acknowledge and maneuver accordingly. The plot would update, the intercept would develop, and Japanese forces would proceed directly into carefully positioned defensive arrangements without knowledge of their existence. Doctrinal assumptions and reality. The challenge facing Japanese forces was not a lack of tactical knowledge or skill. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized attacking from altitude using speed and coordinated strikes. The doctrine was fundamentally sound and had proven effective for 2 years. However, doctrine assumed both sides operated without complete information. It assumed forces could approach undetected until visual range and that enemy combat air patrol would be randomly positioned. These assumptions had been accurate in 1942 during the battles of Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz. Japanese formations had approached American carriers and engaged combat air patrols positioned through estimation. Results varied, but Japanese forces always had reasonable probability of success. By June 1944, these assumptions had become obsolete. American forces were no longer estimating, they were tracking, calculating, and vectoring with precision. Japanese pilots were encountering precisely coordinated interceptions without understanding the mechanism behind them. The day of battle. On the morning of June 19, the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes against Task Force 58. Ozawa commanded 9 aircraft carriers with 430 carrier aircraft. He expected support from 300 land-based aircraft operating from Guam, Rota, and Tinian. He believed he possessed numerical advantage and that his aircraft had superior range, allowing strikes from 200 miles, while American carriers could only launch from 150 miles. He anticipated his forces could attack the Americans, land on Guam for refueling and rearming, then shuttle back to carriers. He expected the Americans would be forced to defend against attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming their defenses. What Ozawa did not know was that American submarines had already located his fleet. USS Flying Fish detected his carriers on June 15th. USS Seahorse spotted his battleships the same day. USS Kavala tracked the fleet on June 17th and 18th. American intelligence had broken Japanese operational codes. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, knew Ozawa was approaching. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from the Lexington, prepared a coordinated defense that would devastate Japanese naval aviation in a single day. Tracking and response. At 7 a.m. on June 19, American radar operators detected Japanese aircraft forming up over Guam. At 8 a.m., a large formation was detected 80 miles southwest of the task force. At 10 a.m., the first major raid appeared on radar screens across the fleet. 69 aircraft at range 150 miles, bearing west, altitude unknown but probably high, closing at 180 knots. Fighter directors designated it Raid 1. The fighter director aboard Lexington coordinated with task group fighter directors across the fleet. Multiple carriers prepared to launch every available fighter. The system that had been developed over 2 years, refined through combat experience, and perfected through training, was about to face its greatest challenge. The fighter director officer in the Lexington CIC watched the plot develop. The Japanese formation appeared as a cluster of grease pencil marks on the transparent vertical board 130 miles out, moving steadily east. Hellcats were already airborne on routine combat air patrol, and more were being launched from every carrier in the task force. Coordination and execution. Fighter directors needed to position aircraft 70 miles west at 18,000 feet to engage the Japanese at altitude before they could begin their attack dive. The Hellcats were scattered across 40 miles of ocean at various altitudes. Radio vectors were assigned with precise instructions. The plot showed the Hellcats beginning to converge as the Japanese raid continued closing. 100 miles, 90 miles, 80 miles. The intercept was developing with tight but workable timing. At 10:23 a.m., Admiral Mitcher ordered maximum fighter launch from all carriers. Every available Hellcat entered the air, over 200 fighters total. The sky filled with American aircraft, all coordinated, all vectored, all positioned by fighter directors watching radar plots. The Japanese formation reached 70 miles range. The lead Hellcat division reported visual contact on a large formation at high altitude ahead. The fighter director gave the execution command. The Hellcats engaged from above and ahead in perfect position. The Japanese had not detected them until Hellcats appeared in their midst. Zero fighters attempted to turn and engage, but the response came too late. The Hellcats were already through the formation, scattering it. Additional Hellcats arrived from other vectors precisely where fighter directors had positioned them. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Individual aircraft attempted to press attacks towards the carriers, but Hellcats pursued and destroyed them systematically. Anti-aircraft fire from screening battleships and cruisers created a barrier of explosions at 12,000 feet. Japanese aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat screen encountered that barrier. Very few survived. By 10:40 a.m., the engagement had concluded. 42 of 69 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 27 turned back or scattered. 0 hits were achieved on American carriers. 1 Hellcat was shot down, and the pilot was recovered by a destroyer. Subsequent raids. At 11:07 a.m., radar detected Raid 2, 109 aircraft, larger than Raid 1, approaching from the northwest at range 120 miles. The task force fighter director assigned intercepts to multiple carriers. Essex took primary responsibility, with Lexington providing support and Bunker Hill launching additional fighters. The system repeated its process: radar detection, plotting, vector assignment, and intercept coordination. The Hellcats already airborne from Raid 1 reformed and repositioned based on new vectors, altitude, heading, and intercept point. Raid 2 approached, and the Japanese formation maintained straight flight with no evasive maneuvers, maintaining formation discipline, exactly as doctrine prescribed. The Hellcats engaged them 60 miles out. 70 Japanese aircraft were destroyed before the raid reached the American task force. The remainder scattered. 4 attacked the carriers, achieving near misses but no hits. All 4 were shot down. The second raid had been eliminated with even greater efficiency than the first. The third raid appeared at 1 p.m. from the north. The same pattern followed: detection, plotting, vectors, and intercept. 7 Japanese aircraft were shot down in the initial contact. The remainder turned back without pressing the attack. Japanese pilots were beginning to understand they were encountering a defensive system they could not perceive and could not counter. The fourth raid launched between 10 p.m. and 11:30 a.m. with 82 aircraft. This formation could not locate the American fleet. They circled, searched, and burned fuel as navigation errors compounded by combat stress affected their operations. Eventually, they headed for Guam to land and refuel. Fighter directors detected them on radar, heading to Orote Field. Hellcats from the light carrier Kalpans were vectored to intercept over Guam, joined by 7 from Essex and 8 from Hornet, 27 American fighters total. They arrived over Orote Field as the Japanese were circling to land with low fuel and defenses down, completely vulnerable. The American fighters engaged with devastating effect. 30 Japanese aircraft were shot down over the field. 19 landed but were damaged by strafing runs. 0 effective aircraft remained from that raid. Battle results and consequences. By 4 p.m., the battle had concluded. Japanese losses for June 19 exceeded 346 carrier aircraft destroyed. American losses totaled 30 aircraft. The statistical disparity was unprecedented. Japanese naval aviation had suffered a defeat so complete that it would never recover. The carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 2 years was effectively finished. The victory resulted not solely from better trained American pilots, though they were superior, nor solely from superior American aircraft, though they were more capable. The decisive factor was that Americans had constructed a system integrating radar detection, coordinated communication, and precise fighter direction into a seamless defensive network that Japanese pilots could not penetrate and Japanese commanders could not comprehend. Understanding the system. The statistics conveyed the outcome, but they did not capture what had actually transpired. Japanese pilots had launched that morning believing they were attacking an enemy who fought conventionally through visual sighting, individual initiative, and pilot skill against pilot skill. Instead, they encountered something fundamentally different. A coordinated defense system that detected them from 150 miles away, calculated their course and altitude with mathematical precision, positioned interceptors perfectly, and destroyed them in carefully orchestrated engagements that provided no opportunity for individual skill to compensate. What Japanese pilots could not observe was the Combat Information Center. They could not see the radar operators monitoring green blips on circular screens, the enlisted plotters marking transparent boards with grease pencils, or the fighter directors with radio microphones issuing calm vectors to Hellcat pilots. They could not see teams of personnel working together with rehearsed precision. They observed only the result. Hellcats appearing from perfect positions consistently, regardless of how they maneuvered or approached. Japanese pilots reported these observations to their commanders, theorizing that Americans must have advanced radar, broken Japanese codes, or placed intelligence operatives on Japanese carriers. These reports contained partial accuracy. Americans did possess excellent radar and had broken Japanese codes. However, these were not the decisive factors. The decisive factor was integration. Integration versus components. Americans had taken detection technology, communication systems, plotting techniques, and fighter direction doctrine and integrated them into a coordinated system functioning as a single weapon. Japanese forces possessed most of the same components. They had Type 2 air search radar with 50-mile range and 5-degree bearing error. They had radio communication, skilled pilots, and experienced commanders. What they lacked was integration. Japanese carriers operated independently. Each ship tracked its own radar contacts and directed its own fighters. There was no unified operational picture, no coordinated vectors, and no systematic approach. Japanese fighter direction remained intuitive and individual rather than systematic and coordinated. By the time Japanese engineers understood what Americans had constructed, it was too late to respond. The industrial capacity to develop a comparable system did not exist. The trained personnel to operate it had been lost in combat. The time to implement it had expired. Japan was losing the war. Institutional development. The Combat Information Center concept had been developed through institutional effort across the United States Navy. After the Battle of Midway exposed critical weaknesses in carrier defense, multiple officers and technical experts worked to solve the problem comprehensively. Radar specialists improved detection capabilities. Communications officers developed better radio procedures. Tactical experts designed fighter direction doctrine. Training officers created standardized operating procedures. The system emerged from collaboration among dozens of contributors, each addressing part of the challenge. No single individual invented the CIC. It was engineered through systematic analysis of combat failures and methodical development of solutions. Lieutenant Commander John Montserrat was one of the first fighter direction officers trained in the new system. He served aboard the light carrier Langley during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In the Langley CIC, Montserrat coordinated fighter intercepts against Japanese raids throughout June 19. His experience that day and his observations of system performance under combat stress informed his later work documenting CIC procedures. After the war, Montserrat wrote technical papers and a memoir describing the evolution of radar-directed fighter control. His 1985 book provided detailed accounts of how CIC operations functioned during the Philippine Sea battle. Montserrat emphasized in his writing that system success came from teamwork among radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors working together with rehearsed precision. Individual skill mattered, but the system made that skill effective. Recognition and secrecy. The fighter directors who vectored the intercepts on June 19 never received individual recognition through medals, commendations, or inclusion in official reports by name. The citation for Task Force 58 mentioned radar-directed fighter interception as a key factor in the victory, but credited the system rather than individuals. The Navy wanted to maintain capability security. If Japanese forces understood exactly how CIC functioned, they might develop countermeasures. Therefore, details remained classified through the end of the war. Fighter directors continued their work without public recognition, training new operators, refining procedures, and improving coordination. The war continued for 14 more months. Every carrier battle that followed utilized the same system through the Philippines campaign, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each time American radar detected Japanese formations, combat information centers plotted them, and fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept. The pattern repeated with consistent results. Japanese aircraft destroyed and American carriers protected. The superiority was absolute. Japanese inability to adapt. Japanese forces never developed an equivalent integrated system. They possessed the technology and intelligent engineers. They had combat experience that should have revealed the problem. However, organizational culture and institutional inertia prevented adaptation. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual initiative and fighting spirit. The concept of systematic coordination through centralized direction contradicted cultural values regarding warrior independence. Even when Japanese officers recognized the American advantage, they could not implement similar systems because the institutional structure to support them did not exist. By the time some Japanese commanders understood what needed to change, Japan's carrier force had been destroyed, and the industrial base to construct new systems had been devastated by bombing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare had entered a new era. Technology alone did not determine victory. The British had radar before the Americans. The Germans had excellent radio communication. The Japanese had skilled pilots and combat experience. What mattered was integration, the ability to combine multiple technologies and procedures into a coordinated system. The willingness to train personnel systematically rather than relying on individual excellence, and the institutional discipline to follow procedures under stress rather than improvising. These factors, more than any individual weapon or tactic, determined the outcome. After the war, the Combat Information Center concept became standard on every American warship. The procedures developed from 1942 through 1944 evolved into modern naval air defense networks. When the Navy developed the Aegis combat system in the 1970s and 1980s, it built upon the same foundational principles established during World War II: radar detection, computer plotting, coordinated weapon assignment, and systematic engagement. The technology advanced dramatically, with computers replacing grease pencils and digital displays replacing transparent boards. However, the underlying concept remained identical: integrate detection, coordination, and execution into a seamless system. Additional naval losses. The submarine warfare that morning had already dealt devastating blows to Osawa's fleet. At 8:16 a.m., USS Albacore fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho. Warrant Officer Sakio Komamatsu, who had just taken off, observed the torpedo wakes and deliberately crashed his aircraft into one torpedo's path, destroying it at the cost of his life. 4 other torpedoes missed, but the 6th struck Taiho on the starboard side. The damage appeared minor initially. However, aviation fuel vapor began leaking from ruptured tanks into the hangar deck. A damage control officer ordered the ventilation system turned to maximum to clear the fumes. The decision proved fatally incorrect. Instead of venting vapors overboard, the ventilation system distributed them throughout the ship. At 3:28 that afternoon, a spark ignited the vapor. Taiho exploded from within as secondary explosions ripped through the ship. The carrier that had seemed undamaged that morning became an inferno within minutes. She sank at 4:28 p.m. with 1,650 crew members. Approximately 1,500 personnel perished. At 11:18 a.m., USS Kavala fired torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku. 3 torpedoes struck the veteran carrier that had participated in Pearl Harbor attack and fought at Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and numerous other battles. She had survived bombs and torpedoes before, but this time the damage was catastrophic. Aviation fuel fires spread rapidly, and damage control could not contain them. At 12:10 p.m., the captain ordered the ship abandoned. At 3:24 p.m., Shokaku exploded and sank. 887 crew members died. The loss of 2 fleet carriers compounded the disaster of losing 346 aircraft. However, the human cost was even more devastating. Japan had started the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. By June 1944, fewer than 1,000 experienced pilots remained. The training program could not replace losses due to fuel shortages limiting flight training.
New pilots received 3 months of instruction, where pre-war pilots had trained for 2 years. The quality gap was enormous. Experienced American pilots eliminated inexperienced Japanese pilots with terrible efficiency. American victory and its cost. The American victory came at minimal cost. 30 aircraft were lost on June 19, with most pilots recovered by rescue operations. Task Force 58 suffered no damage to carriers. The screening battleships and cruisers sustained no hits. Anti-aircraft defenses functioned perfectly. Proximity-fused shells, a top-secret American weapon, detonated near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits. Japanese pilots encountered walls of exploding shells that tracked them through the sky. The combination of radar-directed fighters and proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire created a defense Japanese forces could not penetrate. On June 20, American forces went on the offensive. Admiral Mitcher launched strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. American pilots located Osawa's carriers late in the afternoon at long range near the limit of Hellcat operational radius. Pilots would need to return in darkness with minimal fuel reserves. Mitcher approved the strike despite these challenges. American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet at sunset, damaging several carriers and sinking the fleet oiler Genyo Maru. However, the strike timing forced American pilots to return in darkness. Many ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. Some crashed attempting night landings on carriers. The losses that night exceeded the losses from Japanese action on June 19. Mitcher made a controversial decision. He ordered every ship in the task force to activate its lights, navigation lights, searchlights, and signal lamps to guide pilots home. The illumination made Task Force 58 visible for miles. Japanese submarines could have attacked, but Mitcher believed saving pilots mattered more than maintaining blackout discipline. Most pilots found carriers and landed safely. Rescue operations continued through the night. American destroyer crews recovered dozens of aviators from the water. The final count showed 20 American aircraft lost in combat on June 20 and 80 lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents, but most aircrew survived. American combat search and rescue was as systematic as American air defense. Strategic consequences. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese hopes of defeating the American advance through naval aviation. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, had planned Operation Ago as the decisive battle that would halt American momentum. He believed concentrating Japan's remaining carrier strength could inflict sufficient damage to force negotiated peace. The plan assumed rough parity in aircraft numbers and pilot quality. Both assumptions were incorrect. American carriers outnumbered Japanese carriers, American pilots had vastly superior training, and American technology integrated into systematic procedures provided the United States with an overwhelming advantage. Toyoda's plan collapsed in a single day. The political consequences in Japan were immediate. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18, less than a month after the Philippine Sea disaster. His government had promised victory, but the Battle of the Philippine Sea proved victory was impossible. Tojo's resignation did not change Japan's strategic situation. The war continued, but the resignation signaled to informed observers that Japanese leadership recognized the war was lost. The question became how long Japan would continue fighting and how much destruction would occur before surrender. For the United States, the Battle of the Philippine Sea confirmed that the island-hopping strategy would succeed. American forces secured Saipan by July 9th despite fierce Japanese resistance. Tinian fell on August 1st. Guam was recaptured by August 10th. The Marianas provided bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers. From Saipan and Tinian, American bombers could reach Tokyo. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands began in November 1944, and the Marianas bases made that campaign possible, and American control of the Marianas was secured by the carrier battle that destroyed Japanese naval aviation on June 19th. Long-term technological impact. The technological lessons of the Philippine Sea battle influenced naval warfare for decades. After World War II, every Navy recognized that radar-directed fighter control was essential for carrier operations. The Soviet Union studied American CIC procedures and developed similar systems. The British Royal Navy, which had pioneered some radar techniques before the Americans, refined its own coordination procedures. NATO standardized air defense procedures based on American wartime experience.